Namaskar, this is Akhilesh Bhargav. Welcome to Tit-Bits on Business and Finance with me. It was in July 1969 that the top 14 private banks in India, which then accounted for over 85% of India's public deposits, were nationalized by the Indira Gandhi government in a sudden move. The purpose of the bank nationalization, as highlighted by Srimati Indira Gandhi in a later speech, was to remove the control of a few over the Indian economy. It was to provide adequate credit for agriculture, for small industry, and for exports by the banks. It was to give a professional bent to bank management in India, and it was meant to encourage a new class of entrepreneurs in the country. The sudden nationalization of banks was highly controversial, and it was clearly a political and arbitrary move. In a judgment passed on 10th February 1970, the Supreme Court held the bank nationalization to be void, mainly on the grounds that it was discriminatory against the 14 banks and that the compensation proposed to be paid to the bank owners by the government was not fair, it was not adequate. In order to undo the Supreme Court judgment, the government then issued a fresh ordinance, and it was later substituted by the Banking Companies Acquisition and Transfer of Undertakings Act of 1970 in order to complete the bank nationalization, to complete the takeover of the 14 banks by the Government of India. For similar reasons, 6 more banks were later nationalized by the government in 1980. Apart from the objective of nationalization of banks, as was spelled out by Srimati Indira Gandhi, what also led to the bank nationalization was the inherent fear of the government of what is popularly known as connected lending. That is, loans were being given by the banks to the industrial houses that owned and operated them, thus putting public money at grave risk. For example, in 1966, out of the total bank loans of 2,432 crores, the banks had given direct loans of about 292 crores to companies which were owned by the groups that had promoted these banks. And if the indirect lending to these groups were also considered, then such loans totaled to about 700 crore rupees, which amounted to almost 30% of the total bank loans. In other words, public money was being misused by the owners and operators of these banks through the mechanism of connected lending. And this fear of banks lending to the groups and conglomerates that may own them has been there ever since. The Reserve Bank of India, under the regulations of the Banking Regulation Act, therefore does not give a banking license to any industrial house or a large corporate to prevent any misuse of public funds by them by way of such connected lending given to the owners of the banks themselves. The banking licenses were thus not given to any industrial house even in 1993 or in 2003 or in 2013 when new banking licenses were given by the Reserve Bank of India, such that today none of the 22 private sector banks in India are owned or operated by large industrial houses or large corporates or business conglomerates. The Reserve Bank governors have therefore generally been against the issuance of banking license to them out of customary caution and conservatism expected of a banking regulator. Raghuram Rajan and Viral Acharya wrote a note opposing bank licenses to business conglomerates, and they said that if it was done, then the corporates in need of finance would easily get them from their own in-house banks. They said that the history of connected lending has been disastrous. They questioned as to how can a bank make good lending decisions if it is owned by the borrower itself. If the bank is giving loans to the owner of the bank, of course, the decisions are not bound to be prudent or good for the bank. They pointed out that even an independent and committed regulator with all the information in the world finds it difficult to be in every nook and corner of the financial system and stop poor lending. And it would be simply not possible, according to them, to stop such connected lending if banks are owned by the borrowers themselves. The banking regulators fear that connected lending leads to misuse of public money is not unfounded. A large proportion of banking frauds have involved this kind of lending. The loans given by the PMC Bank to its promoter ruined the bank. Loans given by government-owned banks to cronies of the ruling party have also led to their bankruptcy from time to time. So was the case with loans given by Yes Bank, where Rana Kapoor had a personal interest in the borrower, and even the Diwan Housing Finance Company had collapsed because of a slew of such reasons. Despite these undisputed fears and apprehensions of giving banking license to industrial houses, these industrial houses are powerful and they thus do not give up their lobbying seeking banking licenses from time to time. There are strong arguments on both sides of the table. Those in favor of giving such licenses to business houses say that in a fund-starved economy, these industrial houses can be an important source of capital for banks if they are allowed to be the promoters of banks. They then say that such promoters will bring in the required management expertise, experience, and strategic direction to the management of banks, which today are otherwise known to be poorly managed in the country. They then say that few jurisdictions internationally explicitly disallow the entry of large corporate houses from the ownership and management of banks in India. So why does India do so? These are the arguments of those who favor that banking licenses should be given to industrial houses and business conglomerates. Those who are against giving bank licenses to industrial houses, however, counter these arguments, and they say that the first, ownership of banks by industrial houses will lead to connected lending, which will result in the misuse of public funds, and that can be disastrous for banks, for public money, and for the economy. They then argue that the corporate governance of Indian companies is not yet up to international standards, and that in turn can lead to the mismanagement of the banks if they are allowed to own them. They then say that it will be difficult to insulate and ring-fence the financial activities of banks from the non-financial activities of the promoters of these banks, leading to the rampant abuse of bank funds which they receive by way of public deposits. And finally, they contend that if banking licenses are given to industrial conglomerates, then it will lead to further concentration of economic power in India. We already suffer from huge inequality in the country, and this will only aggravate and accentuate it. These are the arguments of those who do not favor banking license being given to industrial houses. This issue of giving banking licenses to industrial houses was a subject matter of consideration by an internal working group of the Reserve Bank of India, headed by its Executive Director, Shri P.K. Mohanty. This group suggested in its report in November 2020 that large corporates and industrial houses must be allowed to promote banks in India, and that well-run NBFCs in the country too should be considered and they must be given a banking license. This recommendation of the internal working group of RBI is contrary to the cautious and conservative approach of the regulator in this matter. The Reserve Bank of India in a recent report said that while it has accepted 21 of the 33 recommendations of the internal working group, it has certainly not accepted the recommendation of banking licenses to industrial houses. It said that it has accepted the recommendation that the minimum paid-up capital of a universal bank must be increased from 500 crores now to 1,000 crores, and that the minimum paid-up capital of a small finance bank must be increased to 300 crores from the present sum of 200 crores, and that it agreed that promoters of banks must be allowed to have a stake in the banks up to 26% from the present limit of just 15%. But it expectedly rejected its recommendation that banking licenses must be given to large corporates and industrial houses, and that well-run NBFCs should also be given a banking license. The cautious approach of the Reserve Bank in the matter of issuance of banking licenses to industrial houses is understandable and accepted for various reasons. The first reason, a robust regulatory and supervisory framework for regulating and controlling banks and NBFCs in India is still missing. Until that is not put in place, it would be risky giving licenses to industrial houses where the borrower and the lender can be the same. The fact that the Reserve Bank's regulatory and corrective action has always taken place much after huge lapses have been committed by the bank managers, and that has been evident in the case of PMC Bank, Yes Bank, ICICI Bank, Axis Bank, ILFS, 14 public sector banks, etc. That very fact shows the deficiencies in our regulatory setup. Until that is not mended and strengthened, the Reserve Bank should not dilute its caution and it should not give licenses to industrial houses. The second is that India lacks the regulatory and supervisory framework to accommodate industrial groups in this sensitive sector. Further, good corporate governance is lacking in the management of banks and NBFCs in India today. Yes Bank indulged in rampant contraventions of corporate governance. So did ILFS, so did DHFL, so did ICICI Bank under Chanda Kochar, and this list continues. Till this situation is not improved, you cannot let industrial houses control public money by giving them banking licenses. Some experts also think that India Incorporated does not inspire the confidence that it will respect the rules and that it will uphold the ethics needed in the banking sector. They think that till that is not done, they should not be given banking licenses. Even well-run large NBFCs, they say, should be put to test before they are given a banking license by the Reserve Bank. They must be brought at par with banks in terms of regulation as an interim step before giving any entry to them in the banking system. The fact of the matter is that while the glamour and lure of a banking license will continue to fester this debate from time to time, the fact is that it is highly unlikely that the Reserve Bank will change its stance in the coming years. Too much needs to be done. Too much needs to be changed in the matter of regulatory setup of the country, in the matter of management of banks, in the matter of management of companies, before large industrial houses would be given a banking license in the country. This is Akhilesh Bhargav signing off till we meet again. Namaskar.